In this video, we're going to be going over our second SPSS correlation activity. So in this activity, we're actually going to look at a few variables, more than just two, and talk about how we can look at multiple correlations when we have more than two variables that we're trying to look at in a given study. You should be able to find the assignment sheet to download, open up in Word. You can go ahead and follow along, answer the questions as we go through this activity. All right, I'm gonna switch over. So you should see, again, this is the activity. Once you have that opened up in a blank SPSS sheet, we can go ahead and get started. All right, so starting off here, we are talking about another correlation activity, but in this case, you'll notice, if we take a look just quickly at our data, we actually have more than just two variables that we're gonna be kind of looking at here. And in this case, we actually have a situation where there's a literature professor who is interested in looking at some different factors of personality and some other components to see how it is related to students' writing scores. So in this case, we specifically have assessments on both anxiety, self-esteem, and a standardized writing score value as well. Additionally, this professor took note of the gender of each of their students to look at that and see if that had an effect here as well. She had four main hypotheses to her study. Hypothesis 1 was that students who had higher levels of anxiety would have lower levels of self-esteem. Number 2 was that students who had higher levels of anxiety would have lower writing scores. Number 3 was that female students would have higher levels of self-esteem compared to male students. And number 4 is that female students would have higher writing scores compared to male students. So we're going to go ahead, we're going to put this data into SPSS, and then we're going to start evaluating each of these hypotheses when we run our correlation. So I'm going to go ahead and switch over to SPSS, and we'll take a look at how to input this data. So when we look at our blank SPSS document, again, we have our two views down at the bottom. And just like always, I'm going to start with my variable view and enter in my variables that I have listed here. Again, if we look back at our variables, we're going to be entering in our participant number, gender, anxiety, self-esteem, and writing score all into our variable list. So let's go ahead and add each of our variables here as we go. So our variable number 1 is going to be our participant number. Then we have our gender variable, anxiety, self-esteem, and lastly, our writing score. Remembering again not to include spaces for these variable names. Let's take a look at each of the components to these variables that we need to pay attention to. In this case, we actually have all numeric variables. If you look at the values for each of those variables, you'll see they're all numbers. And so our type is going to be numeric for each of them. Our width of 8 is acceptable. It keeps us with enough space to enter all of our data. And in terms of decimals, if you look back at the data, there's actually no decimals for any of our variables. So I'm going to go ahead and just reduce these down to 0 so our data looks nice and clean for each of our values. Let's go ahead and talk about measures here. So how each of these values are being measured. Now for participant number, it's not really being measured, so we don't need to worry about this here. For the other variables, we can identify that anxiety, self-esteem, and writing scores all fall under the scale measurement type. And for gender, we know when we think about gender, that is a different type of variable here than a scale variable. And in this case, it's always going to be nominal because there's no order to the different gender levels. We just have different groups based on the identification of gender. So we're going to choose nominal for that one. And actually, because gender is a nominal variable, anytime we have a nominal variable, we need to come in and we need to assign what values are associated with the corresponding choices for that variable. So if I click on the cell values under my gender variable and then click these three dots on the right, it's going to pull up a new window that I have to then select what those values are assigned. And if you look back at the assignment, you'll see at the end of that first paragraph, there's a note that says that any value of a 0 is indicating a response of female, and a value of 1 indicates a response of male. So what I want to do in SPSS is come over and hit this plus button to add a new rule and say that a value of 0 indicates the label, in this case, of female. I'm going to add another rule and say that a value of 1 indicates the label of male. And once I have both of those value labels entered, I can hit OK, and that's going to lock that in to this cell up here under my gender variable. With that information put in, I can switch back to my data view, and again, we see our variables listed across the top, now entered in correctly. All right, what I'm going to do next is go over to my assignment, and I am going to copy and paste the data into SPSS so that we can work with it there. As a reminder, remember when we copy and paste our data, we want to just select the data itself, make sure not to include any of the labels or titles under the variables. So I'm going to select that, copy this, and when I switch back to SPSS, I'm hopefully able to just do a single select and paste those values in. Remember, if you're having trouble with this, there's a few different ways you can attempt to solve this by right-clicking, selecting paste, or even going up to edit and paste, and hopefully one of those options works for you. All right, so with that said, let's go ahead and take a look at our first question, and that is to report the mean values for our variables. So let's go ahead and take a look here. One thing I want to mention first as well, you may be seeing zeros and ones for your gender variable, or you may be seeing the actual labels that we entered in for that. You can switch back and forth between these two by using this button up here just under help. If we look right here, it's called the value labels button. And anytime I click this, it's going to toggle back and forth between either the words or the numbers that are associated with those values. Sometimes it's helpful to know the actual numerical coding that it was assigned, but oftentimes it's easier to just look at the words, and so we can switch back and forth using that button. All right, so the first question is to report the mean or the average value of anxiety, self-esteem, and writing score. So to do this, we're going to want to run a descriptive analysis on those 3 variables. That's going to give us our mean value for each of those. So to do that, I'm going to go up to Analyze, and I'm going to go under Descriptive Statistics, and I'm going to choose Descriptives again. From here, I want to include my variable of anxiety, self-esteem, and writing score. And when I choose those and hit OK, I get my output window that's going to show me my mean values here. It's going to show me my mean values here of my 3 different variables. So go ahead and make note of those values and then report them in your assignment sheet. Our next set of questions details basically testing each of our 4 hypotheses. So we're going to have one question for each of our next hypotheses. But in order to answer that, we need to run our correlation so that we have those values to identify if we can support those hypotheses or not. So if I switch back over to my data sheet here, we're going to run this just like we have in the past. Now, each of our hypotheses only details or only is referencing 2 variables at a time. For example, hypothesis 1 is looking at the relationship between anxiety and self-esteem. So what I could do is I could go in and choose Analyze, Correlate, Bivariate Correlation, just like we did in our first activity. And I could choose the values of anxiety and self-esteem to include in my correlation and run it just like I did in the first example. However, this means that I'm going to have to come back and do this over and over and over again for each of my 4 hypotheses. So a better way, rather than doing this, is to actually take all 4 of my variables and include them in the list to create what's called a correlation matrix table. This is just going to be a larger correlation table that has all of my variables in it and actually includes values from many different correlations. This way I only need to run the analysis one time, and I can use that table to search through and find each relevant correlation for any particular hypothesis I want to investigate. So let's go ahead and do that, which is a simpler way of running this. So I'm still going to go analyze, I'm still going to go correlate, and I'm still going to choose this bivariate correlation. You might ask, why are we using bivariate if we have more than two variables we're going to be entering? The reason is any actual correlation that's run is only going to use two variables at a time. This will make more sense as we go. We're still going to choose bivariate. And now what we're going to do is we're just going to take all of our four variables of interest, not counting participant number, and we're going to include them in our list. So we're going to keep adding them until we have all four listed over here. Now, I like to go to options. I like to include the means and standard deviations. We've already run our descriptive, so this isn't 100% necessary. So I'm not going to go ahead and do it this time, but normally I would do that to get those values. So with our four variables in and all the default options selected, we can hit OK and run our analysis. And what happens is we get this correlation table or this correlation matrix table that has a bunch of correlation values inside of it. Now, what I mean by that is, let me open this up so that I can make this a little bit bigger. What I mean by that is, remember how these correlation tables are set up. We can see all of our variables listed on the left, as well as all of our variables listed along the top. And just like the first time we ran this, what we're looking for is to see where those variables intersect one another, and that's the correlation between those two variables. So what I could do is I could look and see where does, for my first hypothesis, we're looking at anxiety and self-esteem, where does anxiety intersect self-esteem? And I can find this intersection point right here. Remember, order doesn't matter. So I could also say, where does anxiety intersect self-esteem, and find this point right here. You'll notice again, these two spots have the exact same values, so order does not matter. You just need to find one spot in the table where the two variables you're interested in intersect one another, and you can identify that spot. Those are the values associated with the correlation between anxiety and self-esteem. So if we look at these values, we can start to answer the questions, in this case for question 2, to identify whether or not we can support the first hypothesis. So remember, that hypothesis was that students who had higher levels of anxiety would have lower levels of self-esteem. Let's first identify what type of correlation that is even expecting to find. So higher levels of anxiety with lower levels of self-esteem means that those variables are changing in the opposite direction. We'll just kind of do this too, right? So if we have higher levels of one variable and lower levels of another variable, they're opposites. That means we're looking for a negative correlation, right? We'll see as we come back that sometimes we'll see higher values of one variable with higher values of another variable. That means we're looking for a positive correlation. We could also say negative values with negative values is still going to be a positive correlation because they're changing in the same direction. So keep that in mind as we kind of look through these hypotheses. So we're expecting to find that students with a higher level of anxiety would have lower levels of self-esteem. So we're expecting a negative hypothesis, or sorry, we're expecting a negative correlation. So if we look at this first value, our Pearson correlation, we see that it is in fact negative. So that is step 1 of supporting our hypothesis. And this is also going to be our R value if we're following along in the assignment. And our next value we need to assess is our P value, or our significance value. So we need this to also meet our criteria of being less than 0.05 to say that we can support this hypothesis. We need to have both the right direction and a significant effect for us to support our hypothesis. So in this case, we see that we have a negative correlation and we have a significant p-value, so that we can say that yes, we do support this hypothesis. And as we describe this relationship, because we know it's a negative relationship, we can say that we expect these variables to change in opposite directions. As anxiety gets higher, self-esteem gets lower. As anxiety gets lower, self-esteem gets higher. And so you can describe that relationship for the last part of question 2. Let's go ahead and look at the next hypothesis here. So the next hypothesis, we're now in question 3, is that students who had higher levels of anxiety would have lower writing scores. So we now need to find, where does anxiety intersect our writing score variable? And we find that section right here. So what are we looking for? We have higher levels of anxiety with lower writing scores, higher, lower. We're looking for a negative correlation. We do in fact see that we have a negative correlation. So now we just need to check our significance and see if it meets our threshold. In this case, unfortunately, it does not. It's higher than 0.05. So we have to say that no, we don't have significance here and we cannot support this hypothesis. When describing this relationship, you can talk about it still was a negative correlation, but it wasn't significant, so we can't really read too much into that correlation. All right, for our next hypothesis, now we're getting into something a little bit tricky here. We're looking at gender in this case. Now, gender operates as a slightly different variable, and it's a variable that we normally wouldn't look at in a correlation. We would instead want to use some other type of analysis, say a t-test or maybe even an ANOVA. However, we're going to just look at it here in a correlation to get an idea of whether or not there might be some merit to dive into this variable farther, which we may do in future analyses. So for our third hypothesis, it states that female students would have a higher level of self-esteem compared to male students. So we're curious about the relationship between gender and self-esteem. So where does gender intersect self-esteem? Right here. But before we can interpret this, we need to know, are we looking for a positive or a negative correlation? That's a little bit tricky to interpret because of the way our gender variable works. So what we need to do to interpret this, or to identify the direction of this hypothesis, is to identify what values we used when we coded for gender. So what I mean by that, if we come back to our data sheet, remember we have gender coded as numeric variables, either as a 0 or a 1. In our case, a value of 0 represents female participants and a value of 1 represents male participants. So in our case, higher values of gender are going to be talking about male participants. Lower values of gender are going to be talking about female participants. And this is solely an effect of how we coded these variables. We could have flipped this. We could have changed this. There's no reason it needed to be this way. It just happened to be, come out this way. So higher values of gender are referring to male participants. Now our hypothesis says that female students would have higher levels of self-esteem. So let's just kind of use this as an example. So if this is self-esteem, we would say that female students have higher self-esteem compared to male students with lower self-esteem. So female students are higher, male students are lower. And in our case, we have values of gender. Higher values of gender are the male students, and lower values of gender are the female students. So because those are opposites, because as gender increases, we expect lower values of self-esteem, we're once again expecting a negative correlation here. Because of higher values of gender are male participants being paired with lower self-esteem because we're expecting lower self-esteem for male students. I hope that makes sense. This one's a little bit tricky, and one of the reasons we don't look at gender normally in a correlation is for this reason, as well as t-tests and other measures just tend to be more accurate ways to assess variables like gender. But in our case, for this particular example, we are looking for a negative correlation on this third hypothesis. And if we look at the relationship between gender and self-esteem, we see that we do in fact have a negative correlation. And we do meet our significance cutoff of our p-value being less than 0.05. So again, we can support this hypothesis, and I'll let you describe this relationship between these variables based on what we just talked about. All right, let's take a look at our last hypothesis, question 5, and that's that female students would have higher writing scores compared to male students. So again, we're going to be looking at the relationship between gender and now writing scores. So we have this relationship right here. Again, if we think about gender in terms of the way that it works, higher values of gender are referring to male participants, lower values female participants, and we're saying that there are higher writing scores for female students compared to male students. So we're looking once again for a negative correlation here. If this is confusing, gender is going to be much more clear when we look at this as a t-test. But remember, this all comes down to how we coded for gender and which direction it moves based on the values we assigned to it. All right, so if we look at those values of gender and writing score, we do in fact see a negative correlation. So that's part 1. However, unfortunately, our p-value does not meet the cutoff for significance. It is above our cutoff. So we have to say that we cannot support this final hypothesis. And again, when you describe this relationship, you can talk about the negative correlation, but you must make sure that you mention that it's not significant, and so we really can't read too much into it. All right. Let's take a look now at our last 2 questions for this assignment. Question 6 is asking us, were there any other relationships in the data that the professor could have chosen to examine, but that they did not? So the best way I like to look at this is to kind of take a look at this table, and we're going to break this down and look at what options we have in total in this table. So remember how we laid this out is that we have all of our variables across the top and all of our variables along the side. We look for where they intersect each other to say where the correlations exist. If we, however, look to see what happens when a variable intersects itself, say gender with gender, we see this location here, which actually shows a perfect positive correlation of 1. And this really isn't helpful. It doesn't tell us much. It's always going to be the case that every variable is always positively correlated with itself. We see the same thing with anxiety and anxiety, self-esteem and self-esteem, and writing score with writing score. And so what we kind of get is this effect in the table where this diagonal line ends up splitting the data into 2 mirrored pieces of information, or 2 identical pieces of information. So if we remove these and we just kind of keep this split, we end up with a set of data in this region of the table and a set of data in this region of the table. And they're always going to be identical. Everything in this half is always going to be in the other half. And so if we want to look at every possible correlation that could exist between our 4 variables, we can divide the table up like this, ignore half of the table, pretend it doesn't exist, and then what's left is all of our possible combinations of correlations. And if we look through this, we can say that, well, all right, our first hypothesis, we looked at anxiety with self-esteem. Then we looked at anxiety with writing score. Then we looked at gender with self-esteem. And then we looked at gender with writing score. So we examined those 4 relationships in the data set, which leaves 2 left that we didn't look at. And that is the relationship between gender and anxiety, as well as self-esteem and writing score. And those are the only other 2 correlations that could possibly exist amongst our 4 variables that we have. And so the answer would be, of course, yes. And if yes, what were they? Well, we just identified them. And then were either of those significant? And we can look and identify that yes, in fact, this one here was significant, our gender with anxiety. And so what we're going to do on our next question, question 7, is actually create a graph of this relationship. So we're going to identify gender and anxiety as our significant correlation that we did not yet examine. And we're going to create a graph of this in question 7. And in our case, we're actually going to use a bar graph. So let's go ahead and do that. We're going to go up to graphs. And in our case, we're going to choose bar graph down here towards the bottom. Remember, if you're in an older version of SPSS, you might have to go under legacy dialogues, and then you'll see all these options appear. But I'm going to go to bar graph. We're going to stay with simple and summaries for groups of cases and define this here. Now, our category axis, or how we're going to be grouping our bars, is going to be our gender variable. Remember, we want to do gender and anxiety, so we're going to put gender in as our category so we can see the values for males and females in our case here. However, notice it won't let me actually enter anything in for what those bars or what the value of those bars actually represent. That's because it's defaulted to that those bars are just going to represent the n, or the number of participants. That's not what we want. So we need to change this. And in our case, we're actually going to choose other statistic, or for example, mean. So we want to represent the mean value of anxiety separated out by our genders. So we can see what was the average anxiety for males and what was the average anxiety for females. And once we've done that, we can hit OK. That's going to create our bar graph, which appears down here. And of course, looking at this, we can interpret what does this tell us about the relationship between these two variables. We identify that males in this case had significantly higher anxiety than females. All right, now I'm going to remind everyone, make sure that you get screenshots of your SPSS output. Best ways to do that are to either do the snipping tool or Windows Shift S if you're on a PC, or if you're on a Mac, remember it's Command Shift 3 or Command Shift 4 to get those screenshots. Go ahead and paste those into your assignment with all of your answers when you submit, and you'll make sure you get full credit on this assignment. I'm looking for your descriptives, your correlation table, and your graph on this output. All right, and with that, I will wrap this up and end this right here.